We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to eradicating human slavery, human trafficking, child exploitation, and child sexual abuse material through disrupting networks and applying data technology and advanced analytics and intelligence.
Hello, everyone. I'm Carol Baumier. I'm a Senior Managing Director with Protiviti, and I'm the moderator for today's discussion on the AML leadership view on human trafficking and CSAM. I have with me today a fantastic panel, including Alma Agnati, a partner with Guidehouse, Rick Hamilton, a Senior Vice President and Head of the AML Data Science Solutions with PNC Bank, and Kareem Rajwani and Stuart Davis, both subject matter experts with deep industry and advisory backgrounds. So thank you all panelists for participating today. So Kareem, if I may, I'd like to start with you. So help us kind of set the stage for the discussion we're going to have today by explaining how big this problem is and kind of share with us your thoughts on how well the industry is doing in addressing it.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you to ATII for inviting me. Based on the International Labor Organization, on their latest sort of report, they estimate the annual profits to be in excess of 234 billion. And if you remember, the previous report suggested 150 billion. So now it's at 234 billion. And according to the Global Coalition to Fight Financial Crime, they estimate the revenues to be, close to 500 billion. In my opinion, this is probably just the tip of the iceberg, as we just don't know what we don't know. Also, there's a massive growth in sextortion, pig butchering, child exploitation, among some of the other crimes, which just adds to the problem. In terms of how the industry is doing, certainly I think over the past 5-7 years, we've made huge strides. A lot of institutions are doing a lot of good work. But if you look at the size of the problem, it's probably in the top 5 crimes now. Compared to the number of suspicious transactions or suspicious activity reports, they're in the thousands. So I think we still have a long way to go and lots to do.
So let me ask you to pick up on that, Alma. So how does what Kareem just said kind of track with what you're seeing in your practice, and how would you assess where financial institutions are in this journey?
So that's a very good question, and I have an unscientific data set to talk about. I think we have a slide to put up. So when we do a coverage assessment for financial institutions, we take all of the red flags that the regulators and FATF and other organizations have set are risk indicators for different types of criminal activity, and we see if the institution has automated monitoring against that. And this is, again, an unscientific sample of some mid and large size financial institutions, some fintechs, some payments processors. So it's over the industry. And out of this data set, only 33% of red flags had full automated coverage by these institutions as a whole. 42% had partial coverage, and 25% had no coverage at all. And so I think that's one problem, that institutions may not be focused on those specific red flags and typologies that can be identified in an automated way as well as they could be. The other problem that I've seen when we review institutions is, and you'll hear sometimes people at the institutions say, I only have to report suspicious activity. I don't have to report what kind it is. So a lot of these typologies match other criminal typologies. So the bank sees that, they file, they're on their way. Whereas it would be, we're talking about crimes with current victims, with real people. Like all crimes affect real people, and I'm not minimizing that, but these are real people that could sometimes use help right now. So if the institutions go to the next step, as I know, Karim, you did at Scotia, where you're really training on how to see what kind of crime is underlying this typology so you can identify human trafficking or human smuggling or CSAM, that really gives law enforcement way more direction and a way to prioritize. And that sort of matches, Karim, with what you said. It's a huge criminal area, but people don't file SARs on it because a lot of those SARs are probably blended in with just no economic reason for this activity rather than really investigating to see if it's human trafficking or human smuggling, which is not easy necessarily to identify, but it can be done in at least, I think, more instances than it's being done now.
So I think that raises an interesting follow-up question for both of you. So I heard, in recent years, more progress, but still lots to be done. Why aren't we further along? Any thoughts on that, Karim?
Yeah, and these are my views. Not everybody will like them or agree with them. But from my perspective, it needs to be said. One, I think there is too much focus on check the box compliance, and that's no fault of the institutions. That is what is expected of us. That's certainly been the regulatory focus. Also, traditional transaction monitoring systems are not designed for these types of crimes. Reason being is what we're really dealing with here, relatively speaking, are low value, low frequency transactions. i.e., the average transaction could be, if it's CSAM, could be $5. Human trafficking, it could be $80 at a massage parlor. And in terms of frequency, the transactions are in the hundreds. With traditional monitoring systems, you're looking at high frequency, high value, high risk countries. And if it doesn't fit one of those boxes, traditional systems tend to fail. And my view is, yes, other topologies may pick this stuff up, but given how small the individual transactions are, I fear that we're missing a lot of this stuff. And then finally, I think there needs to be commitment from the top. I know Stuart, I know myself, others, when we were in these roles, we pushed this agenda down. It comes from the top. We as leaders need to obviously educate the senior management team, the board, but also if we push the message down and say this is important to us, it travels through the organization.
Anything to add to that, Alma?
No, I agree with what Karim said. And I think sometimes it might be a focus on the customer onboarding that might help a little bit with that. For example, using data like that, shout out to ATII, that they provide, where you can check your customer who says they're a beauty parlor or massage parlor against advertisements for escort services or things like that. There are other steps that you can take that would get us a little bit closer. And, hopefully, Karim, with the increasing sophistication and machine learning and AI, will be able to sift through those small dollar transactions better to identify at least something that can be investigated further. But you're right, it's hard to find. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack of needles, right?
And we'll get to that more in a minute.
Yes.
So before we do, this might be a good point, and Stuart, if I could ask you for your thoughts on this. Talk a little bit about our partners, talk about the global regulators and global law enforcement and how you see, all of this coming together in the fight against human trafficking.
Yeah, this has been, thank you so much for having me. This has been an incredibly important topic among the global regulatory bodies. And, they have many mechanisms now, much more than they did in the past for information sharing. But with the massive geopolitical conflicts we're seeing, with the increased use of technology in many of these crimes, even AI fabricated CSAM, these types of things are just becoming extremely prevalent. And Karim is right. The crisis is growing day by day. During COVID, that situation didn't help either. I think the UK experienced a 70% uptick in CSAM related instances just in the course of a year or so. And culture and tone from the top is right. And it's not just about looking for it, it's about getting involved with the regulators and forming these public-private partnerships, encouraging other banks to join the fight because there's a lack of banks, and actually advocating for regulatory change. We fought a battle for many, many years in Canada to get relief from some of the privacy restrictions to share anti-money laundering information on CSAM and human trafficking, with a keen focus on human rights and these types of crimes as the basis for that. And good news is it got passed this year in the Ways and Means budget bills. So we're looking forward to how that can be facilitated to help the banks fight this crime. I would also add that we should continue to be an advocate for this regulatory change. Part of the challenge in the US in particular is that the filing threshold is so high at 5,000 or more for most known crimes. And to Karim's point, these are often small dollar transactions, except where it's correlated with larger organized crime groups. And you're right, Alma, it can be, it could be human trafficking plus, car smuggling plus, other drug running. And so it's hard to decipher exactly what's going on. And the good news is it's not just banks that are taking up this challenge. We see this challenge, of fighting and combating human trafficking, paramount, in the travel industry now. Lots of media and materials are presented in airports and points of encounter combating that. And there's been some great work done by various organizations on major sporting events too, where there happens to be lots of these activities. And I think that was a particularly keen challenge at the recent Olympics as well.
Thank you for that. You, Stuart, and Karim have both mentioned commitment. So if you were trying to convince a financial institution to support and be truly committed and to try to make an impact here, how do you go about doing that?
Well, there's a couple of approaches, right? We look at the front end of how the banking institution interacts with society, and that's the branch training the branches, having this is a core red flag that they're observing in their day-to-day interactions with the customers. And then on the back end, we talk about how this can be easily implemented into the back end processes with the use of the data, such as ATII provides, but also some of the increased sophistication of pattern recognition technologies. And so the willingness to share among banks of how to do this is quite high. Just has to be an appetite to consume it. So we want to make it as easy as possible, and that's the way that I found most effective to encourage the banks to participate. The other one is having small consortiums and forum meetings where you've got the regulator there, you've got local law enforcement, because they're absolutely an incredible critical part to this. And in fact, we see more energy sometimes coming from local law enforcement driving this focus than perhaps we do the banks. But when we have the banks, law enforcement, and the regulators in the room, we're really able to get the right conversation going to motivate people to be a bit more active in their participation.
So you brought up a good point, the local law enforcement. So how does a financial institution engage with local law enforcement?
Well, typically a local law enforcement office will have a human trafficking dedicated team, especially in some of the larger major cities. And I can guarantee you this is one of the top priorities. We see it quite significantly here in Ontario and Toronto and other surrounding regions. So there's dedicated teams, and you get in contact with those individuals. They'll share what's going on from their perspective. We can share the insights, and we can find ways to collaborate more effectively. Again, use of data is key, but also recognizing how the money flows through these various types of crimes, because it's not always the same. And it's not always the same for certain types of human trafficking either. I mean, there's human smuggling as a major organized crime area going on right now. There's obviously the sexual exploitation, and as well as the sexual exploitation of children. So all three of these, money moves differently and gets aggregated differently. Remember, there's levels of organized crime with this that are very significant, major, institutionalized almost groups, down to very local, small, 2 or 3, involved people type organizations, typically run by a pimp, and then some small business, quasi small business industries that also act in this capacity. So the money can move differently for those types of organizations, and understanding that as different, as well as how the data is generated from the advertising, from the case history that the police might be willing to share if you have rights to that information, and things of that sort. And then finally, just monitoring public social media, as well as news, because once you find a lead, you just start pulling on the string, and typically you can find other nexus points and connections that lead to a much larger picture.
Great, thanks. And I want to bring Rick in a minute, but Kareem, just how do you get the kind of the institutional buy-in? How do you get the board and senior management behind, the importance of this and really trying to make an impact?
Yeah, I mean, certainly first echo everything what Stuart has said. Also, I think there's often a belief in the institution that this is not happening here. This is a foreign problem in Southeast Asia and not here. Numerous reports have shown this is a domestic problem committed by domestic individuals. So I think it's worth educating the organization that this is a domestic problem conducted by domestic individuals. Yes, organized crime is involved. Something as simple as adverse media screening, which Stuart mentioned. Starting there and demonstrating that this is a huge problem. We've got a problem as an institution. What Alma raised is 33% coverage. Clearly, that amounts to a monitoring gap, right? So it starts with the organization, educating senior management, putting in the right training programs, and then you as a leader of fin crime or AML funding it. Now, we're not talking about huge investments. These can be done at relatively low cost. This is not your traditional transaction monitoring systems where tens of millions of dollars need to go into monitoring. So, and we'll talk about some of the techniques a little bit later. But for a relatively low investment, you can have a huge impact. And again, as Stuart mentioned, participating in public-private partnerships, partnering with regulators. If the regulators at the table or the FIUs at the table on a consortium, all the institutions will show up, will pay attention, and we'll get institutions moving in the right direction.
Okay, great. So Rick, let's bring you in. Stuart did a great job of setting up my question for you because he talked about the complexity of the problem. So we are talking about not just one crime, but a multitude of crimes and different business models that the criminals might use. So how do you even begin looking at this? Rick?
Right. Yeah, it's a very interesting and complicated question that I think spans all typologies, but these really low these are relatively lower prevalence crimes in our book of business. And so they're much harder to detect. And when we think in terms of things like machine learning, we need observations to use machine learning often, and we don't have many. So I've found that we have a four-step approach to designing behavior detection so that it's as targeted as possible and as effective as possible. And we just, it's a simple process: target, collect, identify, and execute. And the targeting phase is really where we need to spend a lot of time in human trafficking, because we have to understand exactly what typology are we talking about. I think both Stuart and Kareem hit on the fact that there are multiple different types of human trafficking topologies, and they probably even vary by geography. So what happens on the southwest border isn't the same as what happens in New York City, is what happens in Los Angeles. So understanding the nature of that particular topology is fairly critical. The other thing is deciding which personas you want to focus on. So are you focusing on the victim? Are you focusing on a commercial storefront? Are you focusing on a customer? What is it you're looking at? Are you looking at a transnational criminal organization that has a part of its operations in the human trafficking space, or is it a smaller operation? Is it moving from Super Bowl to Super Bowl, or major sporting event to major sporting event? Are there known highways that they travel on? So really getting specific helps a lot. I think the red flags are, they're great in terms of where to start, but my experience, in my opinion, is you really want to narrow it down to say, okay, I'm looking for very specifically this person, this type of person in this geography and this behavior. That allows you to get a lot more targeted and focused. The second thing is to decide, well, what information is available to me in order to try and identify the targets. And that spans all of your customer data, transaction data. And I would argue, increasingly, how can we leverage third-party data to know more about counterparty payments so that we can really start to identify and maybe do risk propagation through network analysis to understand, well, we have parties that are dealing with parties that are known to be in the adjacent areas to trafficking related businesses, like the sex trade. That can help identify how or what data I need to go after people. And then you shift to how to identify them. List matching is great. List matching is straightforward. Outside of, there's some fuzzy logic in it, but it's pretty straightforward. Name matching, phone number matching, email matching. And then you can transition to things like decision trees, supervised models, unsupervised models, or even get into graph. And that obviously goes more complex, more expensive. But as Kareem pointed out, it doesn't have to be a major investment of finance to get some success if you target carefully. And then the last phase is execute. You have to get it into production, which is not always easy, going from a development environment to production, and then monitor it. Make sure it's working, challenge it, update it on a periodic basis. So I think those four steps help me, anyway, to break down what is a very complex problem into something that I can actually make, forward progress on.
That's great. So, Kareem or Stuart, from your experience, anything to add to kind of the techniques of looking for human trafficking? Kareem?
Yeah, I think Rick really hit the nail on the head. The most important, know what you're looking for. When we say human trafficking, there are so many different crimes, whether that be child exploitation, migrant smuggling, or sex trafficking. And even within sex trafficking, you can go sex trafficking in the massage parlors. I think so that's important. You can start very simply, adverse media. We're very straightforward. Start with Google strings. It's a start. You're beginning to make a difference. Even though the individual's been arrested, convicted, you may ask yourself, what value am I adding? Well, you're adding financial intelligence. So, they can potentially add charges of money laundering. You're identifying connected parties. You can, now vendors provide adverse media specifically on human trafficking related risks. So you can move from Google strings to vendor acquired data. Analytics. before you get into sort of heavy monitoring models, understand your data, understand external data, know what you're looking for, and analytics. I found analytics is still a great way to identify this, given the complexity of this and the low frequency and the low value. The analytics really helps you to hone in on what you're looking for. And then, as Rick mentioned, then you can get into, call it, the smarter models. More and more data is becoming available on human trafficking, and this is at relatively low cost. You can ingest and then do simple link analysis. And we are now beginning to see vendors specifically target human trafficking related topologies, and some even specialize, which is sort of a great move forward.
Great. Stuart, anything to add?
Yeah, I would add, I love the point Karim was making. I'll keep it simple, because that's how you get the culture embedded in your company, and you get some easy, quick wins, and then over time you can continue to grow the sophistication. But I also want to point out another huge area that we haven't talked about yet, and that's how do we engage in helping the victims of human trafficking and child exploitation. And we've taken steps to offer simplified due diligence in Canada for people that may have lost their identity through the process of being trafficked, and giving them a bank account so that reparation funds and support funds can come in for them as they try to recover their financial lives, giving them a credit card and things like that. These have been efforts we've undertaken in various banks here in Canada, and as part of some work with the UN. But it's a tremendous opportunity to make a huge impact in what every company, and especially banks, care about today, and that's ESG, right? This is giving back under the S to the community and saying, how can we make a difference in a big way? Some banks in Europe have been tremendously successful in this, helping the victims of trafficking, well over 2,000 to 3,000 individuals helped, because the government has a much more formalized program. Other areas, though, and other governments are less formalized. So again, working closely with not just law enforcement, as I mentioned earlier, but your local NGOs that are the recovery homes and the transition points for various victims of many types of including domestic abuse. We've seen a lot of success across the board.
That's a great point, and so important to bring in the victim side of this. So thank you for that. So obviously that's one way that a financial institution might evaluate success or measure success in its program. Are there other ways, Rick, that you would look at success of your program?
I would say the extent to which you've been able to put in behavior detection monitoring on the various typologies that you've identified is a good way of measuring success. And I'm going to echo again the idea of keeping it simple. A series of relatively simple targeted screens on areas that are highly likely to be related to trafficking is a great way to start. And if you can just start accumulating those, right? And you have a rigorous process to get the discipline in place to evaluate them on a regular basis. And as you learn more, right? Somebody says, well, this typology was different, for example. You can go back to your targeting and say, all right, I need to adjust my targeting a bit. Maybe I need a new target, right? Okay, I'll build something simple for that target. I'm making very few events, but I'm in the right space. I'm looking at the activity I need to be looking at. So I think that's a good measure of success. And really the frequency with which you're having conversations around updates to this. I think that's critical. How much you catch is a function of a lot of different aspects of your business, the markets that you're in. So that's a little bit harder of a metric to look at. But I think it has more to do with, are we seeing the kind of activity that would be adjacent to human trafficking, if not specifically seeing human trafficking activity?
So I think both Alma and Karim mentioned that often the topologies we see, and you picked up on this, Rick, are kind of big, and there are typologies that may apply to other financial crimes as well. But I hear you talking about kind of and Karim too, the importance of targeting and kind of taking it to a different level. Is this where a consortium of banks might have a real value in kind of sharing those more tactical approaches to trying to identify human trafficking?
So this is Rick's opinion, but I think we're all in this together. We all want to expunge this from our society, and the extent to which we can safely and securely share what we do with each other. And that's the key, because we don't want it to get outside of our walls. That's why we don't talk about a lot of details in these conversations. I think we can start to move more collectively and aggressively against this kind of activity. Yeah, I'm a big supporter of it. Clearly, in the fraud space, there's a great deal of collaboration and sharing that goes on. I know AML is a different animal, but this is a good area to start. I've advocated for that before, and I continue to do so.
And Stuart, is that what some of the consortia in Canada were doing, kind of sharing this tactical type information?
Yeah, up until the recent regulatory change, right? We couldn't very easily share anything of a personal nature, and it remains to be seen how that will be done in the future. So yes, it was a common language, developing really a common language on the typologies as well as we had our regulator pull together a compendium of various red flags that they thought was appropriate for the banks and registered entities such as payment service providers to leverage and use. But this is not just a Canadian thing or a US thing. I mean, there are many global bodies focused on the same effort, and the research is out there both from the impact standpoint, but also the ways of dealing with this. And so what I've also observed is get involved in local community discussions if available, or if you're in major cities, perhaps some more robust discussions with different types of industry partners, because they're often struggling with the similar institutions. And we've learned a lot from engaging with the NGOs and the actual individuals who have been traumatized and victimized as a result of trafficking and child exploitation. Their awareness of how it occurs, what happened to them, it's highly motivating for internal people to hear that story and be inspired to do something to stop it. But secondarily, they can give you some keen insights into how they were trafficked and how money might be moving that would help a particular institution in a particular market.
Great. So obviously a global problem, as we've said many times, but Alma, a quick question for you that's kind of US centric. What do you think the impact of having to incorporate the national priorities, including human trafficking, into risk assessments for US financial institutions might have on moving the industry along the journey?
So that's a really good question. I was just thinking about that this week because we were doing some risk assessment work. Sometimes I think the risk assessment it is too, for human trafficking, it's too broad. And as Rick said, you need, when you're doing your risk assessment, to focus on what are the likely typologies for your geographic area that your institution covers, and what kinds of, do you have a lot of small business clients, or do you have a lot of private wealth management clients that are more likely to be in that larger organized crime area? Are you in the southwest border where you're going to see a lot of human smuggling? Not that it doesn't happen elsewhere, but that's going to be a huge risk, as we've seen over and over and over. And so by really drilling down in your risk assessment, as the National Threat Assessment wants you to do, hopefully you'll get some good inputs for the kind of rules Rick's putting together, so you'll know, well, where should we start? If nothing else, where should we start and see what we're most likely to find? And hopefully it's not a lot. I mean, that is the problem with all of these rules. We have millions and millions of legitimate transactions and a very small pot of illegitimate transactions, but you still have to find them. And as Stuart was talking about, when you focus on the fact that there are real people caught up in this possibly right now, and if you can disrupt that with the help of law enforcement and the information, that is a real human impact. And I think sometimes those stories, Karim, to go back what you were saying about educating management and the board, this is largely invisible to a lot of people. They don't want to ignore it. They just really don't understand that it's there. So sometimes in board training, I'll put not graphic pictures, but pictures of from the newspaper of somebody saved from trafficking in that geography or things like that, just so people can see. So it is a real problem here. It may not be a huge problem. It's a huge problem globally, but we have to look for it. The fact that we're hoping it's not a huge problem for us doesn't mean we don't have to look for it.
Great, thanks. We've talked a little bit about, maybe more than a little bit about technology and how we use technology in this space, but Karim, talk a little bit about technology and digital platforms as a promoter of human trafficking in CSAM.
Sure. I mean, I think the good news is with large language models, AI, various techniques, I believe this is going to have a big impact. But as we started the discussion, the advice would be keep it simple. If you start with adverse media screening, there's no technology involved. It's Google search strings, ingesting data, moving to analytics. But as you move forward, I think there is opportunities. I'm working with some clients, some vendors where the large language models will look for specific words, will risk rate the article, will tie the name mentioned to your client and tell you whether that's, the victim, the prosecutor, or the perpetrator. So technology, is getting there. I don't think you need to wait for the technology. You can start simple. What Rick said is you've got to know what you're looking for and be precise about that. If you write a rule to say, give me any transaction for $300 that's going to Thailand, that's going to be a recipe for disaster. You're going to be inundated with false positives, and then you've got a bigger problem on your hand from a regulator's perspective, but also the organization's not going to be funding activities like this. So I think you've got to be smart about this. Start simple, but recognize that technology is catching up, and there's a real opportunity to leverage it.
And the flip side, though, technology is also making the problem bigger in some cases, right?
Yeah, from a technology perspective, as much as technology is helping us catch these guys, whether that be encryption technology, chat room, games rooms, AI generated images, and so on and so forth. Technology is having a massive negative impact. Every person across the globe has access to almost every person across the globe has access to a cell phone. And that is leading to a whole bunch of trafficking and exploitation issues. And we saw that during COVID, right? The massive rise in child exploitation because every kid was at home with a cell phone. So technology has its downsides, but it's, I think, incumbent upon us to leverage the technology to fight this.
Great. So one last question that I'm going to direct to each member of the panel. What do you think is one thing that a financial institution or financial institutions could do that would be a real game changer in the fight against human trafficking? Alma, you want to go first?
So I think to have investigative protocols in your procedures where you direct the investigators in particular circumstances to do those simple things Karim was talking about for human trafficking, just to make sure. right? I think that's not always done. Again, it goes back to what Karim said about checking the box. Oh, this doesn't make sense. We'll file without taking that, what might be very simple next step.
Okay, great. Rick?
I would say, assess what you think your institution's risks are with respect to human trafficking. Understand as best you can from your geographic footprint what types of crimes are identified, what types you think would be prevalent within your could be present within your bank. We're bearing in mind that we only see a portion of any trafficking typology. We only see the part that goes into the banking system. So I think that's the first place to start. Size it. And then from there, you can step into something relatively simple, like, a screening logic, name matching.
Okay, great. Stuart?
I'd say two things. Really focus on training and awareness. Training for your branch personnel, but then, we as leaders of our own teams talk about this, bring in some victims of trafficking to your town halls. You will be surprised at the folks on your team that you might not even know that want to get engaged in this and help and do something. So it's just leveraging that opportunity. And again, start small, but you may not know who's going to do that in your organization today. And it's these moments that really help you discover that.
Karim, you get the last word.
Everything my colleagues have said, I think all of those points are important. I'll keep saying what Rick mentioned is target your risk. And once you've targeted that, start simple and focusing on that. You really don't need to go big bang. Understand the risk and focus on how to solve that risk as simply as possible.
Great. So we've come to the end of our panel. So thank you all again for your participation and sharing your great insights with everyone. And thank you, ATII, for inviting us all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Nice to see you all.
Bye.
Pleasure.